Welcome, I'm Aaron.
And I'm Matthew. And on this training video, we're going to discuss the style of beer. It's really very interesting. It's one of the biggest beers that's out there. It's called Russian Imperial Stout. Now, you may be wondering why it's called that. Well, it derives its name from English brewers who back in the 18th century would brew beer for the Russian Imperial Court. Now, they brewed stouts, which was kind of traditional of the time. However, these brewers brewed them with a much higher ABV than was normally typical of the style. They typically would brew these beers anywhere between 8% and 12%. Hence the name stuck. And they take that word imperial, and brewers nowadays have applied that to all sorts of different styles. Imperial IPA, Imperial Red Ale. So that word imperial indicates the higher ABV.
Yes, that's right. Now today we actually are featuring North Coast Brewing's Old Rasputin. This is a pretty well distributed beer. It's offered in almost all states, I believe. It's from North Coast Brewing, which is out of Fort Bragg in Northern California. Now this style historically dates back a long way, but it hasn't been continuous throughout history. It was very popular among the Russian Imperial Court. It was popular, as I understand it, among British railway workers that were building the railways in Russia. The weather was a little bit colder than they were used to, even being from England. So that higher ABV really helped warm them up, and that's kind of where the style was born. Now, the style all but died out, especially in the United States, until 1994, I believe, when North Coast decided to brew this bad boy. Now, Matthew's going to tell you a little bit about who Rasputin was.
Yeah, Grigory Rasputin, a very interesting historical figure, somewhat of a shaman in the early 20th century. He kind of rose to fame by parlaying a sort of pseudo-religion and pseudo-science combined with faith healing to set himself up with the Russian czars at the time who were in control. He was very well liked by the Russian czar and the government. However, he was hated by the Russian citizens who felt that he was responsible for getting Russia involved in World War I. And after several assassination attempts, he actually ended up getting got in 1916. Now, there's been a lot of folklore and myth and legend that surrounds him. If you ever had the time or the interest to, it's a very interesting read, his biography. I highly encourage you guys to do that. And it'll give you a little bit more context and maybe a little bit of mystery when it comes to this beer as well.
I knew almost none of that. What I knew about Old Rasputin was his name was on a bottle of beer.
Well, which in this context is the most important part to know.
Yep. All right, let's open it. Now, I know we've talked a little bit previously about Irish dry stouts and oatmeal stouts. Now, this, while still being a stout, is pretty different stylistically. Really, the only thing they have in common maybe is the color.
Sure, absolutely, yeah. An imperial stout, of course, by definition, is going to have a very high alcohol content, which is why we're using our snifters. We want to pour into the appropriate glassware based on the style of beer that we're drinking. Now, this one clocks in at 9%, which is pretty much standard. There is some variation. Some American brewers are actually brewing much closer to 15 and 20%, but that's not exactly traditionally correct.
Yeah, now, I noticed right when I'm pouring this that the head is definitely not, I wouldn't even say this is off-white. We've been using the words off-white to describe a lot of beers. This one's definitely got more of a mocha coloration to it, a really light brown color to it, which is very nice.
Yeah, it's almost reminiscent of like the foam on a Coca-Cola when you pour it. Obviously, however, this has got a lot more retention to it, and it's sticking around a lot longer. But the beer itself, is pretty much as black as you can get. It's jet black, midnight black. There's no light coming through from the other side. I can't even really see any refractions of light through the side.
Yeah, I don't even see any light coming through the side.
There's really only one way to describe this, and this is just black, which is, again, appropriate for the style.
Yeah, smell it. Wow, it's very deep. There's a very deep aroma. A lot of layers. It's sweet. Obviously, you get that coffeed that little bit ground coffee bitterness, that roastiness, but there's a lot of sweetness that's coming through as well.
Sure, it's like a chocolate sweetness, kind of a combination of both like a bitter cooking chocolate and then also a mild sweet chocolate, maybe like a semi-sweet, like a chocolate chip type of chocolate aroma to it as well. But very roasted, very full, a lot of depth to it. There's a touch of nuttiness as well. Yeah, it's exactly what you'd want for the style. Not a huge intensity on it, but still very deep and very, very rich.
Yeah, and the more I pay attention, the more I really find that chocolate's opening up to that chocolate part.
And this style in particular is typically served warmer than most of your other styles. The actual proper serving temperature for Russian Imperial Stout is really about 55 degrees. So as it's just in its nature that as it warms up, it's going to really start to kind of open up and let you into some of the other depth and complexities of flavor and aroma.
All right.
Let's try her out. Okay.
Yeah, I get, first of all, at the very front of the tongue, I get a lot of chocolate. And then on the finish, you get a lot of bitterness, a lot of roasty coffee. I'm assuming that's from the coffee bitterness on the back end.
Sure, yeah, it's the roasted malts, these dark black patent malts or chocolate malts that really give off that impression of like a cold press or a ground coffee. Leaves a little bit of a dry bitterness on the back end. The carbonation on this is also pretty interesting as far as the mouthfeel goes. Generally speaking, the higher the ABV, the lower the levels of carbonation. Usually those two factors really kind of help combine together. So it's the heavier the beer, typically the less carbonation. Otherwise, you have two competing forces. You know, the more carbonation, generally the lighter the feel. So with a beer like this, you know, lower carbonation is absolutely appropriate for the style.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's almost, the beer's almost chewy. You feel like you can chew on the beer a little bit. It's got a great coating presence around all parts of the mouth, around your tongue, around your palate, and it's really conducive to really almost literally chewing the beer while it's in your mouth.
It's like after you've swallowed it, if you press your teeth lightly together, you can still feel the presence of the beer on your palate. It's really very interesting.
I'm not getting quite as much of the sweetness that I got in the aroma as I do on the taste.
I agree with that. It's more of that bitter chocolate, unsweetened chocolate, really big coffee. There's very, very little fruit presence to this beer as well, which is pretty typical for the style. Generally speaking, you know, ales in general, just an ale yeast, tends to bring a little bit of fruitiness with it, but with this particular style, there's so much presence and so much flavor in that roasted malt that it really kind of just dominates everything about the beer.
Now, there are English interpretations of Russian Imperial Stouts, as well as American versions and interpretations of Russian Imperial Stouts. And it follows the regular Nomer, same thing with IPAs and barley wines. The English ones they're a little bit more hopped, and the flavors are a little bit more intense. And let's talk a little bit about aging, about cellaring. Russian Imperial Stout, almost all beer, first of all, is made to be consumed fresh. As fresh as possible. There are a few instances, however, depending on the color of the beer, the ABV of the beer, the style of the beer, where aging might develop different flavors in a beer or a different intensity of flavors in beer. It doesn't make a beer better. It doesn't make a beer worse. It just changes the beer. Russian Imperial Stout is one of those. Depending on how old it is, the flavors could become more in tune with one another, a little bit more harmonious and blended, or they could start to separate and you get really, really strong, definitive flavor zones as you're tasting it. I'm going to trademark the word flavor zone, by the way. Flavor zones as you're tasting it. And there isn't really a hard and fast rule. Sometimes the best way is just just to experiment with it.
Absolutely, and I've always recommended that, if you're ever thinking about setting something aside for any sort of period of time, always try it fresh first, so that way you have at least some basis of comparison. Because as Aaron mentioned, usually with your higher ABVs, some of that warming effect of just the high alcohol will tend to calm down over time and become more well incorporated with the rest of the flavors. And also, to a certain level, the oxidation that occurs over time via the crown of the cap, for some styles of beer, actually helps to really kind of round out the rest of the flavors. In most styles of beer, 99% of styles of beer, oxidation is one of the least the least desired flavors. It'll really kind of give off like a wet cardboard type of flavor. But for something like a Russian Imperial Stout or something like an old ale, these notes, these kind of oxidized notes, can sometimes bring with them a bit of sherry flavor, which can actually be very, very desirable. And it's always interesting just to see the way a beer changes over time. So as far as the context of the brass tap is concerned, most people that will come through that are interested in an Imperial Stout will typically know what they're looking for when they walk in. This is not a novice beer. It definitely takes a little bit of training palate-wise to be able to take this type of rich, intense flavors.
That's right. And Old Raspy is really the cover boy for Russian Imperial Stouts anyway, especially the American version of Russian Imperial Stouts. I have seen this, Matthew, in 12-ounce bottles like we're drinking here. I've seen it on regular draft, and also you can find some nitro drafts floating around. Now, it's the same beer, but the way it's packaged and the way it's kegged is different. It's kegged with a different ratio of mixtures, not just coming out of the keg, but going into the keg as well. So you can't put a nitro keg on a non-nitro tap or vice versa. But Old Rasputin, I've seen it available in all of those ways.
And I especially appreciate the nitrogen version. It
Me
really
too.
lends a
Me
little
too.
bit, the nitrogen gives it a creamy texture to it, which is not necessarily natural in this beer. And it really adds just another layer of complexity as far as the mouthfeel goes. So if you ever see it, or if your brass tap ever carries it on nitrogen, I would highly, highly recommend not only trying it yourself, but certainly suggesting it for your guests as well.
That's true. And on that note, some brass taps actually get once a year, I believe, they'll get some. If you like this guy, they have some special barrel aged versions that they do on certain anniversaries that they'll throw into a bourbon barrel. So if you ever see that at one of your brass taps, it's a rare
Phenomenal.
and really, really, really nice treat to sit and sip one of those bottles over the course of an evening too.
Absolutely. Well, cheers on this one, mate.
All right, cheers.